Welcome, everyone. I want to take a moment, use this video to kind of introduce our next unit, Unit 10, which is going to be covering the civil rights movement. So, first off, what are civil rights? Now, this is a phrase that we've used in class before. At one time, I probably did give a definition for it. And the dictionary definition says the rights of citizens to political and social freedom and equality. Notice I highlighted the word equality. That's the one word that I associate the most with the idea of civil rights, equality. But with this, I've got a question. Are civil liberties and civil rights the same thing? We've talked about civil liberties in this class before. So, what I want you to do is, I want you to take a moment and pause the video, go and look up what civil liberties means and maybe some examples, and think about what you find. Is it similar to what civil rights are? So, go ahead and pause and do that now. Now, if you looked up the information, what you probably found was civil liberties are your basic rights protected by the Constitution, including the Bill of Rights and our other amendments. So, for example, your First Amendment has freedom of speech, your Second Amendment has the right to bear arms. Do you know what the Eighth Amendment is? It's no cruel or unusual punishment. That's right. Now, let's compare civil rights. They're rights that protect an individual from discrimination. Or another way to say it is they keep us free from unequal treatment. Are these the same thing? No, not exactly. They're relatable, but they're not, because civil liberties are the individual rights, while civil rights are who is enjoying those individual rights and whether or not everyone is enjoying them. And so there's that subtle difference, even though that they do relate to one another a little bit. Hopefully that made sense in the way I explained it. Now, if we're going to be talking about civil rights and or getting rid of unequal treatment, we need to understand what that unequal treatment looks like. And we talk about in the form of discrimination. Now, the textbook definition is the unjust or prejudicial treatment of different categories of people or things. So, similar words you might hear are biases or um, prejudices. A more impactful word you might hear is bigotry. And so, think about when it says different categories of people, what are we talking about? Most often, people are going to be talking about race, because we hear the term racism. And this is probably the most prevalent form of discrimination in history, but it's not the only group that has seen discrimination. And I think we are all aware of that. You also have ethnicity, which many students get it confused with race. Ethnicity isn't always race. That's why on a survey, they have a separate question for Hispanic. Hispanic is not a race, it's an ethnicity, it's dealing with culture. National origin, where a person might have come from, is we see that in the form of nativism that we've talked about in history. Age, gender, sexual orientation, religion, disabilities, and so this is just one list. You could probably come up with other groups of people that might have been discriminated in history, but Unit 10 is going to focus a lot with race and ethnicity, but we will also be talking about age and religion and even gender. So, when was the civil rights movement? Now, that's a little bit tricky. It just depends on what you're focusing on. You know, in Unit 10, we're going to focus on primarily two decades, the 1950s and the 1960s, so about a 20-year period. In this period, we see the biggest changes in terms of trying to achieve civil rights, through the efforts of Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks and court cases like the Brown versus Board of Education. But this is not the only time period where people have tried to achieve civil rights. In fact, in our previous units, we have talked about people and groups that have impacted civil rights. Going all the way back to Reconstruction, our first unit, Unit 1, there were three amendments that were created to help improve the civil rights for freed slaves. So, the first part of our Unit 10 is you're going to explore and refresh your memory on what has impacted civil rights prior to the 1950s. So, go ahead and use the resources in Google Classroom and refresh your memory on some of those ideas.